It's a great pleasure to be here and a very great honor to share the podium with you, Professor Chu. I'm afraid all of that stuff about the biology and stuff, that was kind of just to convince you that I can be nerdy and look at photosynthetic processes and all that sort of stuff, which could be relevant here. But actually, what I'm going to talk about today is how do we take all these discoveries that have taken place and the many that are coming online, and how do we actually use them in society? We all want to do this to get renewable energy into our systems, to get the CO2 down, as Professor Chu has told us, and nobody's there yet. And many people say it's not possible, it can't be done. But many countries have with the Paris Convention, with the Paris Agreement, they said in goals. They said we're going to be CO2 neutral by, or we're going to reduce by, or we're going to. As far as I know, I may be wrong, and if I am, at least this country started first. As far as I know, Denmark is one of the countries that's gone most systematically at this problem, and actually has the goal of removing fossil fuels from all of its activities by 2050. Now, obviously, it's not there yet, but the fact that they started 10 years ago gives us the opportunity to look at how they're doing it and where the levers are and where the challenges are. So I'm not trying to claim that Denmark's the only country that's been doing this, nor am I trying to claim that the Danish solution is the global solution, but I do think by going through the sort of the progress in trying to move to renewable energy, take all these wonderful discoveries that we're waiting for you guys to make, how we're taking them, how can we actually bring them out and use them and solve this problem that we're looking for? So what's the timeline on this? Actually, it was 10 years ago when we got a new government in Denmark in 2007. We got a new government in Denmark. It may surprise people to hear it was a right-winged government. And the right-winged government, when they came in, said, we are going to establish a climate policy commission to try and make a plan for how we're going to do this. Now, this took some time before they did it, but they did finally do it in 2010. How and why would a right-winged government do something like this? Well, we had at that point a very ambitious and a very visionary climate minister from the Conservative Party. Her name was Connie Hedegaard. Many of you may know that she became the first climate commissioner at the EU level. And she established this policy, this climate change policy committee. Wasn't actually started until 2008, which is why the time frame is 2008 to 2010. But in spite of the fact that it was called the Climate Change Policy Commission, it was all about getting rid of fossil fuels. How, why, when, and what would it cost to get fossil fuels out of the Danish system? Now, this sounds today, and we just heard in the last talk, we're linking climate and energy all the time, but believe it or not, 10 years ago, climate and energy were really very seldom linked. It was two things that were, and even when the EU had their first climate commissioner, it didn't have anything to do with energy. Now they brought it together. But climate and energy, Connie was one of the first people to see that it was a wise idea to bring these things together. When she put together this team, you'll note that there were 5 economists and 5 non-economists. Now, I was sitting in the chair, and I have to say, there were several times during the course of all this that I had to bang on the table and say, if they'd wanted an economic report, there would be 10 economists. This has to be more than economy. The other thing I learned by being the chairman of that commission was that economics is anything but an exact science. Now, We had no representatives. We were all scientists or experts in our own right. We had no representatives from government or industry. We had 21 meetings. We held public workshops where we went to communities and facilitated a process, had a facilitator in. They could invite, I think, up to 70 people, and it was up to the local politicians, the local council, to decide who they wanted to invite. Where we had their input, we were working on this problem. And we had a secretariat which represented all of the different relevant ministries. What were our terms of reference? As I remember, we're called the Climate Commission, but we were to examine how Denmark can reduce and ultimately eliminate dependency on fossil fuels in the long term. And then if you go through all these sort of things we have to consider, you can clearly see the signature of all the relevant ministries. There's the finance ministry there saying that we have to ensure high level of economic growth. We have the climate ministry, and so you can go through and you can put the name of the ministry on all of the different requirements or the considerations that we had to deal with. So how did we define independence? A lot of people have said to me, well, you know, I'm not dependent on alcohol, but I drink it. Do we really need to get rid of all of the fossil fuels? And my response to that was, well, you may be you may not be dependent on alcohol, but if you have to rely on that alcohol to count your calories every day, then you are dependent. So we had no choice whatsoever in our work but to say fossil fuels have to go. But on the other hand, we're a part of an energy system in Northern Europe that includes transmission from Sweden, from Norway, from Germany, and we can't really control what they do. So we can't ensure that every electron that comes out of the wall is green. And so we said, as an annual average, the consumption of power needs to be equal to the production of the power that we make with renewable energies or technologies in Denmark. We had two goals, as you can see. We were called climate, so and one of the things we had to do was to worry about the emissions thing, and then to be independent of fossil fuels. And in terms of becoming independent of fossil fuels, we got no advice whatsoever from the politicians of when this should happen. On the other hand, the EU, at the time we started, they had a different goal, but during the time we were working, they changed to an 80 to a 95% reductions of emissions vis-a-vis 1990 by 2050. So, we suddenly have a goal. We say, okay, let's see if this can be done, if we can remove fossil fuels by 2050. So we had these two goals that we worked on. And we said, okay, it'd be easy to get rid of fossil fuels tomorrow. No problem. You just stop it. But you're economically going to be brought to your knees. So that's not going to work. So economic growth needs to continue. Denmark's not an island. Well, actually, it's a series of islands mostly. But the point is, we aren't isolated in terms of our energy system from the rest of the world. As I said before, we transmit energy back and forth. That we should do this as cheaply as possible. Here's my 5 economists and also the finance ministry. That we should not have any top-down control. We shouldn't pick the winner. It should be market choices that decide what technologies that we're going to use rather than command and control. And biomass. Biomass gives lots of opportunities because if you close your eyes and plug your nose, you can have it out in the backyard and think it's coal. You can run out and get it and throw it in. And so biomass gives lots of opportunities, but it also gives challenges because biomass is not an unlimited resource. Biomass is created by using that back into electrochemistry, but the amount of light coming to this planet limits ultimately the amount of biomass that we can produce by photosynthesis at any rate. So biomass gives opportunities, but it gives challenges, and some members, not the economists by the way, because they said we're rich, we'll always be able to pay for it, but there were people on our panel, our commission, that said, it's really, the politicians say to us, help us get to a situation that we're not dependent on an imported energy source. And so then we would go back and say, well, that's fine. We can be free of this one, but then we have to have another imported energy source. So we needed to consider biomass very carefully, and I'll get back to that in a moment. Actually, I forgot to say, the unusual thing, why would Denmark do this as early as they did, given that they were the only EU country at that point who was a net oil exporter? So that's part of the picture as well. We're actually exporting oil while we're madly trying to figure out how to get rid of the darn stuff. So what's the first thing we did? Well, first of all, we tried to decide how much energy do we think we'll actually need in Denmark in the future. And then the next question is, how much renewable potential do we actually have in Denmark? And you can see here that if we set to 100 our total energy need, and we anticipated that energy demand would actually double by 2050. But how much would we actually need, and where could we get it from? Well, obviously Denmark has a huge potential within wind power, but wind alone can't do it, as we'll get back to. We also looked at what the potential was for energy efficiency. And although we're actually pretty good at energy efficiency already, we can actually half the amount of energy we use if we is the technological potential, or was already in 2008 to 10, the technological potential to increase our energy efficiency by 100%. So we worked with two scenarios because we said, we are part of the rest of the world, and what happens out there is going to be very dependent on the price of fossil fuels and the price of biomass. So we assume there's an ambitious world where we keep ourselves to 450 ppms of CO2 in the atmosphere, parts per million. In that case, you'd have a low fossil fuel price because there would be a decreasing demand, but a high biomass price. And in the unambitious world, you would have high fossil fuel prices because of the demand for them, low biomass prices. But that gave us the problem that here might become dependent on something that again comes from outside. So within these two ambitious and unambitious world scenarios, we in the unambitious world also limited ourselves in one of the scenarios to the biomass that we thought could be produced in Denmark. Now, of course, the farmers decided that this was a Buy Denmark clause. It was not, but it was simply trying to say that if we couldn't get a hold of foreign biomass, then at least we'd have enough of our own. So what did we actually figure out? Well, we figured out that Denmark could become independent of fossil fuels by 2050. Actually, we figured out that it could be done earlier, but it would be more expensive because you would have had to retire existing infrastructure before it had paid for itself. So we stuck with the 2050. We concluded that the technology was available already, but expect you guys to come with much more and cheaper. And we also found that the cost was actually very small at that point. I mean, guessing futures guessing prices out into the future is difficult. But we did several different kinds of macroeconomic models and found that actually changing, if you plan it and make sure that you retire infrastructure when it's used and replace it with renewable, actually isn't that much more expensive. Now, what would it look like? Well, we made some assumptions here. You can see this is the potential on the x-axis, the potential for how much energy we can get out of different kinds of technologies, and the cost of them on the y-axis, where you can see wave energy is very, very expensive. Land wind and ocean wind are the least expensive. And then in the yellow, we start moving into solar energy. Now, however, solar energy has reduced in price from when we did our study. So basically, we ended up we both had to do energy efficiency, but we're only going to do energy efficiency as long as it's cheaper than making new renewables. But we would move our system very much from all the this is my PR man. All the dark colors are the baddies there, and we want to get the light colors in. But wind, biomass, solar, heat pumps, and so on will dominate the system. So we need a bouquet of technologies in the future system, and this is very difficult. How do you get the bouquet right when you're not going to do command and control, and you're letting the market decide what technologies you want at any given time? So our picture of the rest of how things are to fit together, we're talking about an energy system. And Denmark's a little country. We're only 5.5 million people. So in a way, I think we're in a better position, and all of the Scandinavian countries are actually, we're in a better position to be able to make these transitions than very much bigger countries. And we spend a lot of time crying about the fact that we're not one of the big boys. But in the time of a transition, being a little guy might not be a bad idea. So we see solar, we see land wind, we see lots of ocean wind. We see district heating with heat storage systems to take the extra electricity from the windmills. And there's supposed to be a little red guy jumping on there. But down here, there's a power plant in the right-hand corner. And the power plant is actually biogas. Dead expensive. But there as backup when we don't need it, and hopefully it would be, the studies that we did, the model studies we did suggested that it wouldn't be used very often, but you need it to keep your base going. And the really important message is that we have to it's important not to super optimize individual sectors, but to focus on a system understanding. And our government system isn't really very well suited to focusing on systems, and we have a lot of lobbying going on from the windmill people or the agricultural people or whatever. So it's very difficult to keep this system focused. Now, we also we realized that removing all fossil fuels from transport, heat, and electricity would almost bring us to an 80% reduction vis-a-vis 1990. So we're going to still have to go further, but it's critical that we do this if we're planning to get to at least 20, but probably will be required to have an even greater reduction by 2050. And as I say, we found that consumers, electricity, people say, I don't want to pay more for my electricity. Bad news, guys. We are all going to pay more for our electricity. But according to the studies the macroeconomic studies that we did, and actually we did too, I should probably tell this story, because when we did the first one, the economists said, this can't be right, because everybody knows it's going to be more expensive. And so they did another type, and they came up with the same actual conclusion. In terms of the cost, not just for the electrical consumers, but for the country as a whole, macroeconomically, we find that, and we assume the growth rates of the finance ministry, which I think are far too high, and people say, oh, do you really believe them? No, I don't believe them, but in order to be able to discuss with the finance ministry, you have to use their numbers, otherwise they're not going to believe it. And quite honestly, if we can do it with those high rates of growth, we can do it at lower rates of growth. And basically the difference, which was basically there's no difference in terms of if you have our GNP or GNP, gross national product of 2008 set to 100. We expect to be twice as rich by 2050, and the difference without fossil fuels is the equivalent of about 3 months growth. So there's really no difference. And interestingly enough, the IPCC, doing this on a global level, in April 2014, arrived at the same conclusion. Now that doesn't mean it's going to happen by itself, because right now we have a distributed cost where we all go out and pay for the fuels, and in the future, if we're using wind and solar, that'll be free, but we need expensive infrastructure right up front. So it's not going to happen on its own. So what happened when we came with our report? Well, the government took the report and they made a plan for where they'd like to go in making an energy agreement, and then they lost the election. So then we got another government in, and they made a plan for how they'd like to deal with this. And you know what? It looked just like the one that the conservative government had done. There was almost no difference, which was great because it meant that we were able to get an energy agreement that went all the way across Parliament. There were only 7 votes out of 192 that were one party that was against it. So we have a broad energy agreement. How could we get such an agreement to go to become fossil fuel free by 2050? We do have a lot of parties on the right-hand side that really don't care about climate change. But believe me, they don't want to be dependent on getting their energy from the Middle East. So they think it's great, climate change or not. And then we have parties on the left that aren't so worried about getting their energy from the Middle East, but they're worried about climate. So we have a very broad agreement, and the goal is to remove fossil fuels by 2050, and the immediate goals in 2020. Reduce energy consumption by 12%, achieve 35% renewable energy, and achieve 50% wind energy in electricity production. We're already there on the last one. And there are a number of policies that have been put in place to do that. A law was also passed in 2014, which says by 2050 we need to be a low-carbon society based on renewable energy. And a climate council was established, and now we're 5 economists and 2 non-economists, and there is an economist in the chair, but I'm on that council as well. And we advise, we give advice to the government and identify, so we kind of identify effective and long-term solutions across different sectors and industries. So where are we now in terms of the climate targets? Well, we certainly met the Kyoto, we met the EU 2020 renewable. We're on our way to meeting the EU 2020 in terms of transport. What's really all about right now is the EU 2030 goals, which are all about the non-quota sector. Now, what's the non-quota sector? Basically, it's transport, agriculture, and some heating and processing industries. And you can see in Denmark, it's transport and agriculture that really fill the non-quota sector. And what we have to reduce is only about this big compared to this wall here. But we're having an awful lot of discussion about it at the moment, not least of which because the different sectors can see who's got to move. And it needs to be agriculture or transport or transport. Now, we're actually in the position in this council of saying to the government, for God's sake, don't do any less than what the EU says, because if you look at our historical reduction of emissions, that's in red, the projection based on EU goals and where we need to go, then after 2030, we're going to really have to pick up speed if we only go after the EU goals. So in our council, we've actually identified a number of things we call transition elements. And here you can see on the x-axis, it goes from very expensive to very cheap in terms of, and we look at it also in terms of, does it actually feed into the 2050 goal? Because you could meet, for example, the 2020 goal of how much reduction in transport by pumping in a lot of biofuels. But you're not going to meet the 2050 goal because there's simply not enough forest, even in Sweden, to fill all those cars. So, and the potential for what they could do is in the size of the bubble there. And you may wonder about the fact that acidification of pig slurry can make a big deal, but I told you we're 5.5 million people, we're 26.5 million pigs. And we actually go in and say that if we used all of these together, we would meet the 2030 goal. But we're also suggesting that we should be changing the gas net, the natural gas net, to be able to take biogas. So we end up recommending these 11 different activities to the government, and I note that some of them are in agriculture and some of them are in transport. And believe me, the lobbies are very, very very strong and not very happy about this. So the question is do we have the political will to follow through on this? We also say the EU has given us a chance. They say, listen, you guys, you're hard hit because you've got a lot of agriculture. So you could do it some way. You could buy emission rights from other countries, or you could take some of your own quotas from the quota sector and buy them and annul them, and that we'll count that towards the 2030 goal. But basically, we're saying, please, please don't do that. It's going to be hard enough, even if we make the 2030 goal domestically, to meet the 2050. And why do we pay in another country if we're going to have to pay for ourselves later on? So we're on the verge of a new energy agreement that has to happen here in 2018. We think it's going to happen in the first quarter. This is the kind of input we've been putting into it. What are the kinds of challenges we're dealing with? Well, first of all, it was mentioned by Professor Chu. What happens, when the wind doesn't blow? Denmark has an awful lot of wind. We haven't done the heat pumps that we need or the solar that we need to play together with it yet. How do we get that to actually happen? Agriculture is a huge problem for us. The upper line shows the development of the percentage of agricultural emissions as a total of Denmark's. It's increasing. It's over 20%. That's because we're reducing everything else. So we'll be left with only agriculture if you're not careful. And if you look at the green line, that's EU. So you can see we're particularly hard hit on agriculture. Agriculture is economically challenged at the moment. And believe me, they really don't like it when you say to them, we're going to do something that will decrease your competitive ability with other countries. Until now, the only way we've really decreased agriculture, these are agricultural emissions. We have reduced somewhat since 1990. Unfortunately, transport has increased more, so we're in a zero-sums game against transport and agriculture. But the only place you really see a decrease is with the green lines there, and that's from restrictions about using artificial fertilizers, also some that there's a lot of pressure to take away. Transport. Our transport sector we have almost no electric cars. You can count the number of electric cars that were sold last year on one or two hands. I mean, it's almost nothing. So we have a real challenge there. So, is Denmark going to become a low-emission society? Are we going to be able to do this? None of us know yet. But I don't think there's anybody in Denmark that doesn't believe it's technically possible already now. The question really is whether we can get this system to work together and whether the politicians have the strength to keep their resolve intact now that the low-hanging fruits have already been plucked and it's time to really get down to business. Thank you.